welcome to the Databricks Diaries. Yeah, I really appreciate your time and really looking forward to the episode. For people who are listening, it'd be worth just giving a brief overview of your background, Magnus. I know you've worked within the sort of AI and analytics space for the past 2 decades. You've helped many complex organizations to use data and analytics and AI to genuinely help change the way that they operate. I think you've led programs across different industries from energy, financial services, pharma, FMCG, and your experience spans Europe, the US, and your home country of Australia. Looking back through some of your experience, I can see that you've built AI programs for national energy system operators, and that's from sort of ground up, covering platforms, playbooks, policy, governance. You've brought in machine learning and LLM into some of your organizations into production. You've been helping shape enterprise data and AI strategies for the likes of UEFA, Unilever, Worldpay, and you've also been involved in designing operating models and governance frameworks and platforms for very heavily regulated environments. So yeah, really excited to have you on the show, and look forward to digging into the episode with you.
Yeah, Daniel, thanks very much for having me. I've been really enjoying the series on AI readiness that the Databricks Diaries have been doing, so really pleased to be here. The little bit of my background is, I started, as you'll probably detect from the accent, in Australia. Started as an econometrician within financial services, but I moved over to Europe, 25 years ago. Working as still an econometrician and implementing. Had my own analytics consultancy for a little while. Probably a little bit too early. It was sort of exited out of that quite well, but sort of 2005, which is sort of the inflection point when people started to take data and machine learning a bit more seriously. But that led directly to me landing at Electronic Data Systems, which turned into HP Enterprise, Hewlett Packard. And then, where I was putting machine learning models into operations for operational efficiency. After that, I did went back to school for a little bit, and then I did some startups and some consultancy. Sort of around about 2012, 10 years ago, let's call it that. I was back in Australia, and this is just at the start of cloud and big data, and people starting to realize that just putting a machine learning model as a one-off wasn't the solution, because you can't scale. You needed to be able to get those models into production, and the team that built it needed to move on to the next one. And so then people started to think about, this is more complicated than just data science. So it became much more of a focus, and I started to shift my focus away from being a developer to an enabler. How do you get the data strategy, the technology strategy, capabilities and governance in place that it will enable the team to confidently scale their data product activity.
Brilliant.
And as you say, most recently at the National Energy System Operator, I'm currently doing a bit of consulting for some clients in the Middle East.
Yeah, brilliant. We were just chatting off air about the opportunities in the Middle East. So I just want to start with 2 relatively broad questions. First of all, what would you say are your biggest AI accomplishments today, or your proudest AI accomplishments?
So, so one of the things, talking about AI specifically, I think a lot of people, when they talk about AI, they're just talking about LLM-driven AI, which is, a concept which is about 5 seconds old. It's only been around for a few years. I think probably some of the most my proudest accomplishments reach back into the machine learning era. Building quite effective predictive models for organizations like Royce, if I go way back. Modeling doing some modeling for their engineering departments about predicting failure. Through to, I had a fantastic team at Unilever for a period of time who, used some really clever and innovative solutions, multiple different machine learning disciplines, being brought together in order to really affect how and modernize how they were doing product development. And seeing that go all the way through the life cycle from ideation on a whiteboard, through to prototyping and into production was very exciting.
Interesting.
And really underscored, I think, that ethos that if you're not getting it into production and if it's not going to be adopted by the end users, then you're wasting your time.
Interesting. And on the same sort of side of things, what would you say have been some of the biggest challenges that you faced, along your career?
Yeah, so without a doubt, the two that stand out is adoption or awareness by the non-technical audience, your non-technical end users. You can go and build, a machine learning product or an AI product. They need to be comfortable with it, which means they need to understand if it's machine learning, they need to actually understand, not at a detail of being able to develop it themselves, but they just need to understand the concepts so that they can trust the output. And likewise with LLM-driven AI, going beyond a chatbot, if you're using, agents, for a more complex level, the end user needs to understand what's going on, so they understand. Can I just take this? Do I just take the output of this on blind trust, or is this something that I need to? It's content that's been developed for me, but now I need to work with it a bit more efficiently with it. So the non-technical education piece would be one, and the second piece I would say data quality has been the issue since day dot. And, here we are in 2026, and I think we're all still, and look at your previous guests, when you were asking them what's the most important thing if you want to be successful at AI, they all said data. One of them, I think, even said data. We're still struggling there.
Yeah. Okay. And then just digging into that a bit, Magnus, then. So if they've been, some of your biggest challenges around that sort of the adoption, the awareness, and also the data quality issues, I'm sure you're not the only person that's experienced those challenges. So just on those 2 points alone, and I know we've covered a bit around the data quality in other episodes, but just from your perspective, what do you see that works well to try and overcome, those couple of challenges?
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, I like to have this saying, which is that every little bit of data analysis implies a transformation. And what I mean by that is, you're doing some analysis to discover something new. And having discovered it, if you don't change your way of working or your way of decision making, then what was the point? And likewise, if you didn't discover something new, what was the point? So I think the biggest challenge is inertia or resistance to change. I think, and particularly, I think with AI, everyone wants to be seen to be doing it, and maybe less accepting that having done it and had a data product or a tool built for them, there is a transformation. There has to be adoption means embracing a new way of working and a new way of thinking about it. If we're just building tools, and then the team and the process remains the same, we haven't really, achieved the promise of what this amazing technology that's available to us. We haven't achieved the promise of it, and I think there's a lot of effort going in, and maybe not so much genuine impact coming out the other end.
Yeah. And when we started the Databricks Diaries, like what we were trying to do is create thought leadership, speak to people like yourself who've got decades of experience in the industry, and we're trying to help educate our listeners who are going on the AI journey, so to speak. So from your perspective then, Magnus, and having listened to a few of the other episodes, which we spoke about offline, where do you think are some of the biggest opportunities, some of the things that people aren't potentially thinking about, talking about? What what advice could you give to the listeners who are going on this journey?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I was having a conversation last week, and somebody was asking me about something that I've changed my perspective on. And so my answer to your question is, actually around the governance and the role of governance. I think that, and the need in the AI era to reinvent how we're thinking about governance. In that, going back to data governance, in the days of data governance, the goal was really to make sure that the organization didn't get harmed by data, that it was being secured, that it couldn't be stolen, that it was consistent, and that it was of quality. In the era of data and AI governance, I think governance now plays the central role in enablement. And I think that means we have to rethink what the principles are. And I've been doing a lot of work around this lately, talking about trust and safety. But one of the ones that I've added into my framework, which I don't think is being, broadly or consistently applied, is around control. And what I mean by control, there's both control and reliability. Reliability is the production grade tools that I was talking about, that is whatever you build, that is able to just, a non-technical person is able to access it and run it whenever they want. But control is going to get very interesting in the era of agentic AI. If we've got models that are basically being used as the input for other models downstream, then we're going to have an ecosystem where the parent model has such a diverse ecosystem of endpoints, and we need to be very careful about the governance to make sure that we know where those endpoints are. Because obviously most data scientists or software developers, they know what their lineage is upstream. They know where their input data is coming from, but they don't necessarily have visibility about who's using the output of their tools downstream. And what that means is you need to be able to confidently change or retire, terminate a model with awareness of where those downstream endpoints are, and having redundancy and plans in place to cover off those risks. Of if we've retired people because a job is now being done by machine learning or AI, if the parent model or upstream model needs to get changed or stopped, do we have a contingency backup resources to step in? And I think that's a risk that we're probably just getting. I think a lot of the tools and the technology that's out there are ahead of the curve on this. I'm not sure how well organizations and companies that are rushing headlong to adopt AI have thought through some of those risks.
Okay, so what would the processes look like then for these organizations who perhaps are rushing ahead of themselves? Like, what did they? Yeah, let's just talk through that process and thinking and what that should look like.
Yeah. So I think the good news is, I think that despite the rushing, as I said, I think we're struggling a little bit on the adoption side. And so, in a way, sort of one of the mitigating, the risk that I'm referring to is actually mitigated if we're not actually transforming and adopting the tools, in the fullness that we sometimes say we are. So that's one thing on the upside. On the other side, it really just is about, I think, combining data and AI governance as a concept. I sometimes see them being separated, and I don't think that's going to work, because at the very least, the output of your AI is itself data. But having a very clear catalog and registry of your data and your models and your tools, and how they're an ontology of how they are linking together, and having that very rigorously being monitored as your ongoing monitoring and reporting program of your overall data and AI program, is the critical step. And like I said, I think some of the tools that are available and are coming out from Databricks and the competitors are the architects of those tools are thinking about this. You can see that they are putting those features and capabilities in place. We've got to make sure that they're being adopted and are being used correctly.
Okay, and what's the best way of educating organizations who perhaps aren't aware of this or aren't thinking about their data and AI, governance, and they're just seeing maybe the shiny tools? Oh, we need that. We're not utilizing that, part of the platform, etc.
Yeah, no, also a great question. I think there's a couple of answers to that. I think one is with the regulatory bodies, to make sure that the regulators are aware of it and are demanding that level of safety and control into industries. And some industries, as far as that goes, are more advanced than others. And then I think it's just having the industry, just through conversations like this, just need to be better at talking up. Everyone wants to talk about the very exciting, shiny part, aspects of AI and how amazing it is. I think the technical professionals in the industry have a responsibility to, we don't need to advertise or promote or be evangelicals. The concept has well and truly been sold, and the purveyors of the LLMs continue to sell it as hard and fast as they can. I think those of us who are kind of maybe a bit more familiar with what's going on under the hood need to be raising these questions and putting in place those governance structures in the organizations.
And you mentioned before, Magnus, about well, you said a couple of things. You said, like, people need to start rethinking the principles. So yeah, let's stick on that. So rethinking principles. So, like, from your perspective, what were the older principles, and what are the new principles that people should be thinking about?
So yeah, great. I think the older principles are not necessarily wrong. I always felt that some of them were perhaps a little bit clunky, and perhaps being driven by, I don't want to diminish concepts like bias and ethics by calling them buzzwords, but when you sort of see multiple principles that are talking about bias and ethics in multiple different principles, I think there's something not quite working there. I think that should be more of a one-to-one relationship. One of those principles should capture bias and ethics. So, the framework that I've been using starts with trust, and that goes to that education piece and awareness piece, and making sure that your end users not trust just from the point of view of a data scientist is able to show the test results, but also that the end user really actually understands what that means, understands, are they receiving a point solution or a probability, and how should they apply that? And then that sort of goes through safety, and then we start getting into control, which is that principle that I was talking about do we have the ability, as we start talking about it, particularly agentic AI, to have control of the ecosystem. And it's more than just being able to control a single model. If we end up with an ecosystem of models downstream, understanding what the impact of a change in one place is, where are those impact points? So I think that control one is really, really important. And then we go through compliance, regulation, and this is going to be a rapidly changing and evolving field, which means that organizations are going to have to be rapidly evolving with it. And then I go into reliability, which is the production. If you want to scale, you have to get your tools into production. So if a team build a model and then basically have to stay with the model to keep it running, then you can't scale, and then we can't realize the benefit.
And what do you think would be the consequences if an organization doesn't have some of the correct controls and the correct framework in place? Like, where do you see that going for them?
Well, I think this is, I don't want to sort of sound like an alarmist, but I think that question should be the fundamental question that we're asking ourselves right now as we're going into agentic AI as the foundation, and the frontier models are getting more and more powerful and doing more complex things that we don't necessarily understand. When we start getting into the concept of an agent building another agent, I don't think that anyone can really confidently say what the implications are. I just need to be fair. We need to be having a conversation about what adoption of the particularly the frontier, the newest frontier models, what that actually means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
But I will come back and say, just to, I sound like an alarmist, but I will come back and, say my original point. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is adoption. And in a way, the lack of adoption or transformation, adoption of new tools, inoculates us from the immediate impact of what we're talking about.
Okay. And then just outside of adoption controls and the framework, Magnus, that we've spoken about, if you're sitting down with a CDO, head of data, C-suite that's thinking about this journey, what other things are you talking about? What other things are you trying to get them to think about and make sure that that.
So the first one is awareness and adoption. One of your previous guests, talked about, at the board level, if they want to adopt AI and these technologies, why do they want to adopt it? Are they able to articulate what they're trying to achieve, or are they just adopting it for the sake of adopting it? So when you're getting into a very clear conversation about what the business goal is, beyond your vague concepts of productivity and efficiency, that sets the rest of the agenda, because that will help you define what your roadmap looks like, and the roadmap will define what your data rules need to look like. So, what are the data quality, and what's the data infrastructure to have that data asset in place? And everything really flows from there, because then if you've done that, if you've got that data asset, you can build tools get them into production, and then you're back at the start again, where the end user will actually adopt them. And that's how you're going to get genuine ROI from this technology, not from counting how many use cases you've built, but how many of those use cases are actually, or even how many of those use cases are in production, but how many of them are actually being adopted as business as usual tool sets, which is not a data and AI. That's a transformation and culture problem.
Yeah. And on the culture then, what are you seeing that is holding organizations back, or organizations who are succeeding? Like what are they doing to make sure they've got the right culture, the right skills, the right people?
So again, this is an age-old problem that goes back, throughout my career. The first thing I'd say is that people are generally very resistant to change. Change is scary, and nobody enjoys it. That's just the fact of human nature. So one of the ways to get people more open to change is for them to be more aware of the tools and the technology that are coming in. I try very hard to avoid, or I don't, I'm not one of the people who believes that AI is coming after all of our jobs, for example. I think that I can make a lot of evidence of this from everything from, one of my favorite analogies is the washing machine. It was supposed to be, this incredible labor-saving device when it came in, and all that happened was we did more washing. I've got photos of rooms full of actuaries who are working all day on what's effectively a spreadsheet that in the 80s anybody could hit F9 100 times a day and on their own recalculate the spreadsheet that would have taken these 50 people all day to do. We just do more analysis at a lower level. So, machine learning was supposed to replace us all by 2020, and yet we're all still here. Now, AI is going to replace us all. There will be some impact for sure. We're already seeing some of that impact in the junior levels of software development and perhaps the legal industry as well. There's going to be some transformation, but ultimately we need people to understand the technology and understand how they're going to use it to make their job more powerful, and do the things that are going to have a genuine impact on the way their business runs. I always like to say that if you get built a machine learning model and you got 5 people out of the business as a result, the economics of that are probably 1-to-1. You probably haven't achieved anything, and you've just annoyed a lot of people, and nobody else in your company will ever talk to a data scientist again. The objective is to empower those people to turn that business unit from a $20 million business unit into a $100 million business unit. So, I think the event, the conversation about how can this at the end user level of how this technology is going to make their work life better rather than make their work life redundant. I think is a key to this, to unlocking this concept of adoption and openness to change.
Mm-hmm. And I remember one thing that we spoke about sort of before the recording was around how you think, or what your opinions would be of where this all sort of plays out. How will this AI bubble, play out, and where should people start investing, whether that be, in learnings, in tech, like what advice would you give to people?
Yeah. So, I've been saying this for a while, but I think now this is coming out, through all of the media and the narrative. I mean, everybody is starting to say, "Hey, do we need multiple frontier models?" And I think that the fact that we do have multiple competitive frontier models is driving a slight perversion of the narrative, which is to say that the people who are selling those frontier models are overselling them because they're trying to convince everybody that these will do everything, which they may in time, but it will be, I believe, a relatively slow burn to see them being adopted. And then at the same time, they're trying to fight each other for market share. So there's a particular narrative that is coming out of those big AI companies that I think that people should generally avoid. What they should be looking at instead is, and this is there's a lot written and a lot said about the American strategy versus the Chinese strategy, where China sort of, roughly speaking, have only one LLM, and they're forcing companies, and particularly state-owned companies, to be much more proactive in the adoption of that technology. So another analogy, I'm a bit big on analogies, but I talk about here in London how you have St Pancras Station and King's Cross Station, right next to each other, which doesn't really make any sense. And one of those two companies will have lost their shirt back in the day. The people who will have made very good money were the people who built their factory in between the two train lines. Because whatever you were building in your factory, sort of, up in the Shires, it doesn't care if it gets to London on track A or track B. It's a completely undifferentiated experience for the product. And we're sort of in that same situation. We need to be not worrying about the brand of the LLM or the type of AI, just concentrating on what we're actually doing with it in order to drive productivity. Which brings me back again to those two key points of adoption and the quality of data.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. And Magnus, is there anything else? Obviously, I want you to use this as your platform to, discuss your passions, and the advice is great. Anything else you'd like to shed light on or discuss?
I think the only other point that I'd make, and I think it's probably come out a little bit, and it's getting back into the adoption thing again. But the point of our AI, that where we're going to get, where it's going to have this incredible transformation on our working lives, is when we get past the bots. When you realize that it's a tool that's you're going to use these LLMs to build other tools. And when you've got relatively non-technical people able to reduce the time to market for them to develop a tool that's going to make a difference in their life, then you're going to have a genuine productivity bump. And so instead of the life cycle being, I have an idea, I have to go and get a an architect and a designer and a software engineer, and you go through all of the iterative processes, and eventually you get a prototype process that could take months. When you have an individual able to produce a working prototype almost immediately, test it and verify it, it's not going to replace their job. It's to make them more powerful at their job. Then we're going, it's silly to even speculate what the world will look like. And I can't even speculate really what the time frame is that we're talking about. Is this, if we were having this conversation, in February next year, we may be living in that world. We could also just be living in a world where the hype has started to come out of AI. Everyone's got a bit bored of it, and we're not seeing the transformation. So again, I think we're having a more mature and realistic conversation is really key.
Is there anything that you're sort of seeing right now that's as close to, I guess, utopia that's having an impact?
I think that's a great question. I think I'm really impressed with a lot of the tooling that I'm seeing. A lot of the, everyone from Databricks and the competitors I mentioned before, are, I think, using this technology to make it easier to use the technology, if that makes sense. It's a little bit of a tautology, a little bit clunky, but the technology, the base technology exists and it's pretty good. There's going to be another layer above that of tools that are using that technology to build other tools and put those in the hands of end users so that they're able to properly adopt the technology in the way I described before. Building complex solutions and prototyping themselves very, very quickly. So I think we're at that level, that mid-level at the moment, where the features and the tools are coming out really quickly, which is great. And now we'll see how the market reacts.
Yeah. What about in either your day-to-day or your personal life, Magnus? Like, where do you benefit most out of the tools that are available to you?
So easily, I would say, if I could go back to when at the start, I was talking about my career. I started as a data scientist, let's say that, and doing my own development, and then kind of went more into looking at the data and data governance and enablement and the overall data and AI strategy. And somewhere along that journey, your technical skills somewhat atrophy and you lose the muscle memory. What I'm now realize is that, with these tools, I can be a coder again. I can go and develop a fairly complex model myself really, really quickly. Using some methodologies and libraries that didn't even exist the last time I was hands-on and technical. So in that way, I think these tools make everybody a much more rounded and powerful individual. That's been really exciting in the last few months.
Brilliant. Still doesn't do our washing though, does it? Unfortunately, my house is like a laundrette with two young children.
That's right. I love. I don't know who said it, but it's someone who said, I want AI to do the laundry and the dishes so that I have time to do writing and art. I don't want the AI to do my writing and art so that I just get stuck doing the laundry. Yeah, we've got that for sure.
No, brilliant. Really interesting. Yeah, different perspective as well. And I think you have covered, a couple of areas there that perhaps we haven't touched on the on the series. We've been covering AI readiness now for 20 odd episodes, so it's always good to get new nuggets of information that our guests can benefit from. And clearly, you've been in this industry for a long time. That comes across on the recording. So yeah, great to have you, Magnus. Really appreciate your time, and maybe we'll welcome you back in.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. I'll say the last word. Let me just say is I don't think I was trying to be contrary to your previous guests, rather than complementary and add to it. I didn't want to sit here and just talk about the importance of data, because that's been covered. So but if I didn't emphasize it enough, it's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, no, totally.